everybody. Thank you all so much for joining today's webinar. It's presented by the Global Advisory Alliance. Should medium-sized businesses prioritize sustainability? I'm Jennifer Ryan, Sustainability Director at the Martinez Consultancy, and I'm a former editor and journalist at Bloomberg News, and I'm going to be your host today. The importance of sustainability for medium-sized European firms is in question. The EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive regime had been set to require these companies to give greater detail on their activities. However, the EU omnibus package to simplify these rules, which was approved in December, left many medium-sized players exempt from mandatory CSRD reporting. And today, in fact, hours ago, the European Council voted to approve these scaled-back reporting requirements. To be sure, the omnibus was already pre-approved by the Council, so today's decision was more a formality. But what it does show is that member states are very aligned on all of this, with over 90% approval. What does this mean for companies? Well, if they're medium-sized, they may now see a light to pull back from decarbonization and resilience, and that's why today's session is very timely. Our panelists will highlight concrete examples of the benefits of advancing sustainability strategy and reporting, explore competing priorities such as AI, and discuss how organizations may navigate internal and external hurdles to stay the course. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our partner Datamaran and their corporate sustainability community platform, Harbor. Harbor is designed to support in-house professionals in medium to large-sized companies with practical resources and peer learning opportunities. You can join Harbor for free and access a growing library of tools and community events. The link to join is in the chat. And speaking of the chat, please do drop your questions in there as the session progresses. I'll now introduce our distinguished speakers. First, we have Susanne Stormer, who has just been appointed chair of the Global Sustainability Standards Board, the governance body responsible for setting the Global Reporting Initiative standards. She is leader in residence at Copenhagen Business School and has also served as partner at PwC Denmark and vice president of corporate sustainability at Novo Nordisk. Her reporting experience includes serving on the task force that developed the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. Andreas Rasche is professor at Copenhagen Business School and is also the school's associate dean for the full-time MBA program. He has written more than 60 academic articles and cases, has published 7 books, and most recently was co-editor on The Ethics of ESG, which came out in December. He has collaborated with the United Nations and World Health Organization on several projects and worked on ESG regulation. Ole Bach Andersen is a seasoned business executive with a background in IT consulting. He was among the early global pioneers in integrating sustainability into consulting service offerings. Today, Ole runs his own consultancy, SustainImpact, where he supports companies in embedding sustainability into the core of their business. We'll start off with a question for Susanne. How does integrating sustainability in business strategy deliver better financial results? What are your thoughts here, and can you give any specific examples?
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I think just to answer this question, I'd like to start with the why. So why are you in business in the first place? For most business leaders, this is a simple question to answer because we are here to meet the needs of our customers, to solve a problem for them, whether through delivery of products or services. And when we are successful at that, we provide value to our customers and we make a healthy profit from doing so. So that's simply good business. The thing is, we would also like to stay in business, to be successful for the long term and to be future fit. And this is where sustainability comes in and can be turned into intrinsic business value. And we cannot continue to make profits from causing problems to people and the environment, even if it's not intended. So that requires understanding the factors that influence your business and the role of your business in the ecosystem of mutual dependencies that you operate in. So it's about reading the signals, it's about interpreting how to respond, practical decision making, and then getting ahead of the curve. And most importantly, to be ready to change, either because you read the signals and act, or because there's pressure coming from providers of financial capital, customers, from the market, employees, or external stakeholder groups. And even if the pressure from regulators in some regards may be eased, customers will still be asking for evidence that you are effectively and proactively managing risks to your business. So I'd like to cite the annual global survey by PwC among CEOs. It asked the question, if your business continues on its current path, for how long would it be viable? And to that question, 4 out of 10 respondents say less than 10 years. So that begs the question, so what are you doing about it? And what we see is that the most common actions taken by companies are to innovate their products and services and to target new customers. There's also tactics about collaborating with other organizations, targeting new routes to the market, and perhaps also implementing new pricing models. So regardless of size, business leaders need to take a steer from global developments and trends. And these trends apply to all businesses. How do we get enough energy, water, food in the right quality at an affordable price? How do we adapt to climate change and operate in balance with nature? And how do we safeguard human well-being, enabling people to thrive? So the survey also explores how business leaders seek to generate revenue from investments in the green transition. And encouragingly, a third of the CEOs report that they actually see an increased revenue from climate-friendly investments, as they are called. So that is decarbonization, typically. And they also, 20% of them can demonstrate that they reduce their costs if they do that. So if we simply look at two of the metrics that business leaders everywhere will keep a close eye on, cost and revenue, you'll get the picture. And then you could add another two, namely risk, which is cost avoidance, and reputation, revenue enhancement. So sustainability in a business context is all about resilience, innovation, and long-term value. And then we can get into the discussion about how this pans out.
Okay. There's a lot to talk about there, but I think before we dig in, I want to move over to Andreas, because I think he's got something that he's been looking at specifically regarding medium-sized CSRD Wave 1 companies. What are the reported business benefits that you see from sustainable management?
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. I mean, there are a couple of studies of CSRD Wave 1 companies, and these, of course, include medium-sized companies. And I think it is incredibly. First of all, let me say it. I think it's incredibly important that we discuss and that we research these companies, because I must say, very often also as a scholar, scholars focus only on the largest multinationals, because this is where it's very easy to get the data. You know, you just plug into a database, download the data, and then you produce the results. So that, in a sense, of course, is more work when it comes to medium-sized companies, and that's why I think it is so incredibly important that we really start to give this a clear preference also in terms of how we study. The studies that we have, I think they show three things. This is, of course, a little bit generalizing, but I think it's fair to say that. The first one is the CSRD brought the DMA, the double materiality framing, into medium-sized companies. And the DMA, in a sense, is a strategic framework. And I think this is, it was misunderstood in the beginning as a pure compliance tool, you know, where kind of companies said, oh, you know, it's something we have to do. This is a pure compliance logic. But strictly speaking, it was always designed as a strategic framework to identify risks, opportunities, and also positive and negative impacts. And I think this, of course, if you take this seriously as a medium-sized company, it helps you to think about risks, opportunities, and impacts, and it helps you to connect these towards your business processes and also your products, right? So I think that's the first big item. The second item, I think, is internal. We know from a number of studies that the introduction of CSRD kind of integrated reporting more in companies. So in an organizational sense, it enhanced cross-unit collaboration, because quite a bit of reporting actually moved towards the finance function, or at least involved the finance function much more than before. So this, I think, at least for me, is another key benefit, because you break up silos and you start to have discussions internally around sustainability. So it's not, you know, this one sustainability unit, or maybe the one lonely sustainability soldier that we're talking about. It is more an integrated process, and I think ideally this is the way it's supposed to be. And the third point of these studies is around visibility. Because you need visibility internally, but also externally. We always think about reporting as a transparency mechanism, right? So we think about a lot of kind of external visibility. So we kind of think we report and then a bank or an investor picks up the data and they kind of use it, for instance, for their risk calculation. This is true, but it's also important to think about internal visibility. Because if you report and if you make sure that the data is used, you give visibility to topics internally. And this can matter, for instance, for capital allocation decision. This can matter for budgeting. This can matter also for the product pipeline, planning around the product pipeline. So I think this visibility was something that the CSRD brought, probably also as a result of point one, the double materiality process. So these 3 points, the double materiality, the governance, the cross-unit collaboration, and third, visibility, I think stand out in terms of benefits. It's not all, but I think these are patterns that we saw across a number of studies that were conducted last year.
That's interesting. And we're going to move over to Ole, but I know that he has been looking quite a lot at double materiality in his own business, but we can get to that later in the session. I mean, for now, something that I want to ask you, Ole, is if you can give some examples from your experience on what you've done to prioritize sustainability.
Sure, I would love that. But before, maybe just comment on Andreas' 3 priorities. I think one of the things that companies made visible was the value chain, and that was a huge eye opener for a lot of companies that hadn't done that before, and that gave a huge amount of insight. But we can get back to that. Yeah. So prioritizing sustainability, I thought I would start by sharing my initial journey into sustainability, where I, as a VP, formed a strategy with the intent of growing our business with sustainability as a lever, and created a number of projects. One project was about employee training and engagement, because if we're going to sell this, our consultants need to know what they were talking about. Another project was focused on selling existing solutions that powered client impact, and with a built-in sustainability agenda, of course. And finally, one project which built in emissions reporting into our monthly project status reports. And in doing so, then sustainability would become a natural point of discussion with our clients at the status meetings, and would be used to spawn off new ideas on how to reduce emissions, like getting rid of data that wasn't needed anymore, more efficient algorithms, better energy planning. In other words, add-on projects or upselling stuff. And the main idea here was to build sustainability into the core of our services, because then you get the complete organization to back it, and you would have the potential for scale. And so that's an example of how I prioritize sustainability as a business leader.
It's interesting because that idea of integration is just what Andreas was talking about with respect to some of the points he was making. So I think we'll have to come back to that as well. But there's a couple of big questions that we need to ask given where we are in the regulatory environment. What do you all expect from the change to EU reporting rules for medium-sized companies? Do you see that there may actually be a broad pullback from sustainable management? And if so, sort of in what circumstances? So Ole, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I must say that I have seen from day one, early on in the omnibus package, when it was framed, that there was massive layoffs. I mean, and change of roles for sustainability professionals. But of course, that's only natural when the reporting burden has been reduced, right? The real question is whether the actions for reducing impact has changed. And I see a more mixed picture here, where those that had already started on their sustainability journey, they seem to continue, at least to some extent, while those that haven't started, don't start at all, unless their large clients require them to do so, or, and to me, that's an indication that insight triggers action. So, the real question you can say is, how can we help these companies make sustainability profitable for their businesses, and how to use sustainability as a fixer for current business issues, in my view.
Susanne?
Yeah, just to add, I think it's important to make the distinction between sustainability management or performance and sustainability reporting. As I said, maybe the requirements for reporting have eased from the regulatory side, but speaking of the value chain, most businesses would have customers, and mid-sized companies would have larger companies as customers who would be requiring that sort of information for their value chain reporting. And therefore, you may think that now it's all fine and you don't need to do that, but they will be expecting that. And I think there are two tactics here. So one is the large companies that demand it of their suppliers. So they would say, if you don't decarbonize, for instance, then you will lose our business. And then there are others who take a more collaborative approach and say, let's look at what we can do together to find solutions to solve that. But in both cases, you need to make your decisions based on data. So the problems are not going away, nor are the requirements for robust data.
I think you asked for kind of whether it's a broad pullback, and I would say probably not a broad pullback, but the problem is that we will lack scale in the future. I mean, the idea behind CSRD was that you mainstream really sustainability reporting. I mean, you had roughly 46, or actually over 46,000 European companies in scope, and we reduced this to now roughly 4,800. So I think from the medium-sized perspective, we will have companies that, of course, walk away from that. But I've also seen first survey evidence. So the first surveys are coming out. How do companies react? What will their decisions be? And I think what we can say is probably that those companies that have been exempted and that already reported, for instance, under the NFRD and that were Wave 1 companies, they are likely to stick to the reporting. Why? Because they have the systems, they have made the investments, their stakeholders are used to it. It's usually baked into the routines that they have. They do not have a strong incentive to walk away from this. I think it is more about those particularly Wave 2 companies that now will not get to it, right? Because they don't have a legal incentive anymore to pick up reporting. However, I very much agree with what Susanne said. I mean, if you look into the expectations along the supply chain and the value chain, right? If you look into what banks are asking, business partners are asking, you see a situation in which many of them will be, in one way or the other, required to disclose data, either through reports or bilaterally.
Yeah, Ole.
But still, as you mentioned, Wave 2, Wave 3, all companies except micro companies were supposed to be reporting in the years to come, and that has gone away. So when I speak to CEOs of mid-sized companies, they don't feel the pressure anymore. They would have got pressure for a lot of their clients. No, maybe now it's very, very few clients. So I think that to some extent, at least, there's somewhat a pullback, unless it's part of your business strategy or whether you're deemed so by your larger clients. At least that's to some extent what I experience.
I'm thinking about stakeholders, just to kind of broaden out the scope of what we're talking about here. Have we touched on who all the potential stakeholders are there? For example, employees, might they continue to be a source of pressure for more sustainable business lines? Or is the pullback from other firms going to be too great for that to make much of a difference?
Well, I think we have some evidence that employees kind of value companies being active in the sustainability space, and that it is an important argument to motivate, retain talent. So, and I think it's one of the often overlooked arguments in there, and it's also, to be quite honest, not that well researched from an academic perspective. So we don't have that many studies on this kind of link between, for instance, companies' engagement in certain practices like reporting, due diligence, and so on, and the effect on employee motivation. But I certainly think it is a potential argument. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
When I recruited people, it was not something that for the newly grads were brought up in the recruiting discussions, but afterwards, they would name it that was important for them. But so to me, it was more like a third or fourth priority for the actual case. But I did speak to a CEO last week where he did not feel the pressure from any of his clients, but he was continuing the agenda and using the employees internally to make sustainability initiatives. And his retention rate is very, very high. So people love being part of these initiatives and have a feeling of actually creating value for both the company and for themselves and for the planet in that sense.
Okay, we've got actually a question in the chat that touches on a bit this issue about stakeholders and sources of pressure. It's regarding supply chains, and especially with businesses outside the EU. There seems to be some different geographical market and human resources capabilities that they need to consider to be fully sustainable. So the question here seems to be, how can corporate sustainability due diligence directive, which we haven't touched on yet, contribute to global sustainability in business?
Yeah, I'd like to have a go at that because it taps into what Andreas was talking about with the double materiality assessment. And without knowing the prior knowledge of our webinar participants, whether they have actually been going through that exercise. But what it does is that it forces you to understand your entire value chain, up and down, to identify what are the risks to your business and the risks of your business to people and the environment. And these latter category could come back to you as might be considered pre-financial risks. So this is an important mapping, and in that risk identification, you have to look for where is there a plausible risk that is sitting in your value chain that you then need to act upon. And the due diligence directive is requiring that you understand that value chain and that you act upon those risks that would be there. So not every single stone, but you need to turn every stone to understand where those risks are, because they might be distant from your headquarters.
I think it's a good question, and if I may just comment briefly on it, I'm doubtful of whether this CSDDD in its current form with the current scope really will have a massive effect on, as the question says here, global sustainability in business. Why? After the omnibus changes, it's around 1,200 European companies that are left in scope. These are really big companies. Sure, they have long supply chains. Even if they all now start to really do due diligence, let's assume that, then of course you have some effects. But I think the problem here is scale at the end of the day. And we know again from scientific studies on due diligence that quite a bit of companies that actually approach due diligence, even under the CSDDD framework, have still approached it from a quite compliance mindset. And this is actually, strictly speaking, what the CSDDD was trying to challenge. It was trying to challenge this kind of cascading compliance model, where companies were trying to push through codes of conduct through their supply chain. So I'm a little hesitant here to kind of really believe in global scale. I think it's still great that we have it, and I think it's good that we have a law because that sends a signal. But we need more scale behind that, and that is maybe something for the future.
There's a question in the chat, which, given this discussion we've just had about risk, we should all probably take, because one of the viewers is asking, do customers have a similar definition of risk? Are we all operating from the same position, the same starting point?
Definitely not. I mean, when we do our DMAs, and we saw that in the first waves and the ones preparing for wave 2 and so on, a company has their own risks as they see it. Their clients might be using them for a very, very small subset of their business. So, of course, they have a larger scope and different kind of risks. So the good dialogue is when they actually talk together and say, how can we minimize the risks that are important for you? And those kind of discussions are the ones that should be triggered when doing sustainability and stakeholder analysis, right? Reaching out to your clients, reaching out to your vendors, discussing with your employees and your owners and so on, what is really the big picture here. And that is part of the DMA, as Susanne was referring to earlier, and a very valuable part, as we saw from the first companies.
Yeah, it's interesting because we've just been talking about some of the benefits that the reporting gave to companies to managing risk, looking for opportunities. And so now with the Omnibus Compromise, those requirements are sort of gone. So I think we could consider the question, do you think the Omnibus Compromise really helps medium-sized businesses?
Well, it's certainly removed a huge potential burden for reporting, right? So in that time frame, but instead, I would say that we know, from research that the planetary boundaries tells us that we need to speed up, but I think it was a huge daunting task. So instead, looking backwards, I would say, we should have slowed it down. We should have started by requiring by law that companies report on scope 1 and 2, include associated policies, actions, and targets, and so on, and start there, because then that would pull in the methodology, the understanding, and that would generate, in my view, at least a stable market for climate accounting and understanding, which was intended by the EU Green Deal, right, to build business, and then build on that. I don't know how you other guys see that, but yes, a reporting burden has definitely been removed.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it depends. No, go ahead.
No.
Go ahead.
No, I just think it's a good point that in hindsight, there would be many things that could have been done differently. I think what we shouldn't underestimate is the fact that with the CSRD and the European standards, we've actually sensitized the entire business community and its stakeholders to what we are talking about. And if we then take the regulatory requirements out of the equation, there would still be, as I mentioned before, the requirements from providers of financial capital, your bank, your lenders, your investors, your owners. There would still be the requirements from other stakeholders. And if you just follow the money and go for the providers of financial capital, there's another one that we haven't talked about, namely the insurance companies, because your insurance premium is likely going to be higher if you cannot demonstrate what you're doing to adapt to, say, climate change and mitigate those risks. So now we have a language for addressing these risks that were formerly seen as intangible and hard to quantify. And I think we shouldn't underestimate that.
I mean, in terms of the reduced burden for medium-sized companies, to be honest, I'm not so sure whether I follow the politicians on this. I mean, when they presented the omnibus, Vladis Dombrovskis and others, I mean, they were portraying it like, that now we get rid of all this red tape and it will help companies so much to become more competitive and so on. And I never really bought into this narrative, because also, I mean, as Susanne just said, many of the medium-sized companies, they face real-life expectations by, for instance, banks to deliver such kind of data. So you cannot just simply pack your stuff and just walk away from it. I mean, this doesn't work, right? You can, of course, legally speaking, exempt companies from regulations, but you cannot exempt companies from social and environmental risks. They are there, regardless of whether you exempt someone from a law or not. And I think this is something where I would have wished a little bit more reflection, prudence, and careful acting also on the side of the EU. And I don't want to go into the process details here, but I think this would have required a proper impact assessment in order to really get to these points.
I agree, but if I talk to medium-sized businesses all the time, and they just, they probably just pushed the problem forward, but they had to do a lot of work, and I agree that it should have been simplified, but it should not have been deregulated in the way it is. But I think it's still, as you mentioned, Susanne, there's still the risks and the opportunities, and I think sustainability offers a fresh lens and a vocabulary that we learned, and a crystal ball in some sense, right? Because if companies have been working on process optimization for years and years, and they have been honing their procurement disciplines and so on, but a new angle reveals new stuff. So if I can have the time to just mention two examples of this.
Yeah.
A European paint production company was told by their sustainability department that they needed to see water as a scarce resource and what that meant for their production. And these guys have been optimizing their production setup for years, right? But what they found was a less water-intensive production method, overall cheaper and more efficient production method, because they never thought of water as a scarce resource. And that's some of the things that the new perspective brings in. Another example is a Danish manufacturer of an electronic kind of product, which of course requires a lot of electronic components. And what they have seen is that their supplier will no longer accommodate them because the growth of data centers and military equipment is on the rise, and they require, their procurement department to do some risk buying, or even, go to the gray market or accept higher prices because these resources are no longer readily available. And while a sustainability lens could have seen this, you might also have said, well, we could have done some demand-side scenario planning. But what these traditional methods do not provide is the whole, the wholesome thinking, so to speak. So the circular approach of regaining, repurposing, reusing existing components. This is where sustainability agenda, and what we also learned from the CSRD, even though that the circular approach had been for years, is offering new services like something as a service, which is not only recurring business, but it's also part of the solution for lack of resources.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting because if you're talking about all the benefits of the reporting and the clarification, the crystal ball the companies get, but also that the EU has perhaps learned a lesson about how it approached this initial stab at requiring reporting. Do you see, or do you even want the EU to take another go at it, to come back with some other set of rules that companies would be better able to manage, or have they missed the boat completely now?
I think if we get a new commission in 2029 and a new parliament, then I think we can probably have these discussions again. I do not personally think that it makes a lot of sense under the current commission to roll up this. And I also think, politically speaking, this is not what is wanted. There is a review clause in the omnibus. So in 2031, the scope of the CSRD will be revisited again, and then maybe with a kind of discussions to extend the scope. But I think to get to significantly different results, we would also need a different political landscape. And of course, we all know that at the moment things are very difficult for a number of reasons, not least the Trump administration, which, by the way, and I just want to mention that briefly, has put enormous pressure also on the European institution on the omnibus, and this certainly played also a big role in terms of the scale of the rollbacks.
Yeah. Okay.
I think also I would like to remind us all that even if the European mandatory reporting is being rolled back or scaled down, then there still is, on the global scale, a number of reporting regimes that exist and that are gaining traction. So now that I have my affiliation with the GRI, of course, to mention that remains the leading global set of reporting standards for impact reporting, so on the impact of companies. You have the ISSB standards under the IFRS that are going via requirement from stock exchanges, from jurisdictions, that companies are reporting on certain dimensions of their performance related to financial risks. And we are also seeing outside of Europe, certainly in East Asia, in Latin America, a number of constituencies or jurisdictions are doing this. So I stick to the position I've had all along, that mandatory reporting is a very key ingredient in getting sustainability on the agenda in business. But Europe is not the only game in town.
Okay. I guess, thinking about where companies are now that this burden has been lifted a bit, what other priorities are going to sort of elbow their way in and knock sustainability aside to compete with prioritization within a business? I mean, is the choice between sustainability and something else, such as AI or any other idea, a false one? Or if there's real competition, how do you make sure sustainability stays pretty high up on the agenda?
You understand the interconnectedness of the problems. I think that's the best way forward. There is a great survey. I think it's the CEO surveys that come out once a year. And what you've seen in recent years is, that CEOs kind of say, yeah, sustainability, that's a bit 2022, right? Nowadays it's geopolitics and AI. So, but if you look at geopolitics and if you look at sustainability, you see overlapping agendas. And just to give you two examples, I mean, the EU is currently reframing a lot of its sustainability legislations. For instance, the Industry Accelerator Act that will come out on Thursday. Why? Because they need to solve geopolitical problems. We are too dependent on fossil fuels, so decarbonization is a natural response to that. We are dependent on rare earths from China, so recycling the products that we have that contain rare earths is a natural reaction to it. So this is the way we need to think about it, and I think we think too siloed about these different priorities, and then we try to pitch them against each other. Here's geopolitics and there is sustainability, and I think it would help a lot if we start to really think of them in systems terms.
Okay. I want to come back to this idea of pressure, political pressure from outside the EU, because we're getting a couple of questions on this. I mean, thinking about other sources, we've certainly seen as the US has put pressure against prioritizing sustainability, we're certainly seeing China trying to take more of a lead. How is that going to play out for EU companies? Or are EU companies more sort of succumbing to pressure from the US? It's a trick question.
I can take it. I mean, I followed it quite closely. I mean, yes, I mean, the US has put a lot of pressure on Europe. There were basically two big players. It was Qatar and the US who put a lot of pressure on the CSRD and the CSDDD. And the biggest problem they had were the climate transition plans and the fines, simply because the fines were 5% of global net turnover. If you take the global net turnover of Qatar Energy for not complying with the climate transition plans, you have a fine that that is very substantial. And they, of course, knew that, and that's why they lobbied against it like hell. Ever since Trump took office last January, of course, lobbying from the Trump administration, Howard Lutnick, Secretary of Commerce in particular, has been very intense. I think we need to see all of this in context. I mean, Europe pushed back a little bit on this, but they also modified, for instance, the fines. They deleted the climate transition plan. So there is also kind of some giving in here in terms of the pressure. However, I think by and large, Europe remained its independence, and of course, for European companies, that also means that. Of course, regulations from other areas, for instance, China, the US, can also capture European companies because most of them have extraterritorial reach.
Okay. I'd like to shift gears with the questions a little bit because we've been talking about geopolitics and quite high-level issues. I want to bring it down a little bit more to some really practical ideas that companies can implement, to take away, to prioritize sustainability. So one question is, how do you think medium-sized enterprises can start to even find opportunities to implement sustainable practices? Yeah.
Yeah,
Ole.
I can have a go at that, because I think also building on what's been said previously, we need to start thinking about sustainability as something that is outside of our business. If we think of sustainability as how do I, that means how it can be successful for the long term. That's what any leader in a medium-sized company, or indeed any company, should be thinking about. And with that, I would my basic recommendation would be follow the money, as you've always done. But to go back to the double materiality assessment, or if you haven't done that, to draw up a map of your business and the resources that you depend upon. And then, like if you had water pipes, look for the value leaks in your business. So where do you see value that is leaking out of your business that you can either stop the leak, or you can think about how you can leverage and turn it into revenue generation or cost avoidance. And I would actually start with a conversation with my bank advisor, because as we know, and we mentioned the insurance companies issuing fines, they definitely carry the risk and see the risk, and therefore they translate it also to their customers. But if you look to the banks, they are under an obligation to ensure that they can demonstrate that they direct or channel money into supporting the green transition. That legislation is still there. So what the banks have been doing, and I've seen it in practice, is they have actually been educating their staff to be having that kind of conversation with their customers about where the risks may be here and now and for the longer term, and then what can be done to mitigate it. And think of your bank advisor as a partner in crime on this. And I think you would have different conversations.
Ole, before we move to you, I want to push back, if I can, Susanne, on something that you mentioned, this idea that officials at a company, senior leaders at a company, need to start focusing on the long term. Because one thing we do know about the kinds of pressures that CEOs, CFOs, the C-suite face is that there's so much short-term pressure. You've got to do the quarterly reports. You've got to look at the daily, hourly, minute-by-minute share trading. You've got any kind of limits on how long people are going to be able to serve. So how do you manage the long-term thinking when there is so much pressure to think short-term?
Fully agree. And I think that's where the language we have for short term is about profitability, whereas the long term is more about, the long-term value of your business. But the point is that there would be ways where you can analyze your margins, and even if they're quite low, then any percentage or even a decimal that you can improve in your revenue is something that will give you profitability here and now as well. You talked about the employees before, and I think one often overlooked dimension is what is the cost of having, for instance, a higher turnover than your peers? That is something that translates into lower productivity, apart from higher hiring costs, etc. So I think you need to look at what is behind the numbers, not just the numbers in themselves. But I fully appreciate that that there is this pressure on the very short term for everyone in business. So
Ole, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I'm biased as an advisor here, but if you are struggling with business issues, you're typically looking at revenue and cost and so on. And if you want to sell something new, it's probably the easiest to sell to existing clients, right? And if you want to co-develop or work with your existing partners whom you trust, that's much easier than finding new vendors. And if you want to innovate with your staff, as Susanne was mentioning innovation, you work with your staff, and that's stakeholder analysis. That's part of the DMA. And as Susanne has explained earlier, that identifies impacts, of course, but also risks and opportunities directly. And when you work on risks and opportunities, you have to put on financial value to it. So you actually get a prioritization of what to do. And then you can turn that into strategic initiatives. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that the largest impacts typically, and thereby risks and opportunities, are to be found in your value chain, as we have talked about earlier. And value chain analysis is part of the DMA. So to me, in order to find my method for supporting companies to cope with their existing struggles or agendas is to perform a lightweight DMA, double materiality assessment.
Okay.
And turn that into strategy.
Okay. There's a question in the chat that I would love for us all to take a look at, because I think it's quite interesting to think about the language that we're using. There's a question: would it help actual value creation if we skipped words such as sustainability and ESG and just focused on sound, profitable business that continues to prosper over time? I see lots of nodding.
I think it's not a bad idea. I actually like it, because sometimes language is in the way, and to some degree, I mean, I don't want to sound too philosophical, but language shapes reality to a large degree, and I think some of the problems we get because of language. All the pushback against diversity, that also has a strong linguistic conception or rationale behind it. So I do not think we should maybe completely let go of these words, but I would certainly appreciate to reduce at least the use of these words, like particularly these broad concepts like sustainability, because I mean sustainability is a collection of a lot of different topics, right? That fall into the E, S, and G domains, and maybe even beyond that. So talking about sustainability as a broad concept is difficult in any sense. So maybe it is really just better to focus on particular topics, the problems, the risks, the opportunities, and link them to value creation processes in the companies. I think then you get to the good stuff.
But if the question, if the thinking behind the question is we can just leave it out, then I think what sustainability provides is exactly the system perspective that you were talking about earlier, Andreas. And we need that understanding in order to work with these issues, in order to have a future fit business for the coming years as well.
I agree. But the problem I'm seeing is that you might also run into lots of stereotypes. For instance, when you talk to a board about sustainability, then they might say, "Oh, sustainability! Oh my God!" So that's I'm looking for the door. So it's so I see where the question is coming from, but I agree with you. Of course, the result should not be that we abandon the discourse. But I also didn't understand the question in that particular way.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, because the thing I wonder about is if we did get rid of all of that language completely, then how could we compel focus on some of the broader goals of CSRD, such as decarbonization, meeting the 1.5 target, building our resilience to physical climate risks? I mean, how would we begin to make sure that companies really are on board with achieving that broader social goal?
I don't have the answer to that, but I just want to say that, one of the pitfalls, maybe why we are here now, is because there was a huge focus on reporting, and that was a huge task in itself, right? So a lot of people had to learn the lingo, had to understand it in order to report it, and in that context forgot the business agenda. And we need their business agenda, but we also need the understanding. And if we don't have the pressure from regulation or from our larger clients, then we don't get to think about that. And I think the only way to do this is to focus on fixing business issues, but having the understanding. So I don't know if you guys can help me build that bridge, because if people are not prioritizing, they're not getting the view.
I think in my view, it's a lot about value drivers, connecting the kind of sustainability topics towards value drivers in the company, and that is, I think there are some frameworks for that, and I think this is exactly as you say. This is something that probably wasn't done enough in the past year. You know, we approach particularly the reporting debate more from the kind of reporting angle, but on the other hand, you know, I think we judged also way too quickly. I would have just liked to give this entire debate and the CSRD implementation another 1-2 years time, because if you look at studies on regulatory implementation, the first year is always a difficult year. I mean, there is probably not one regulation in the EU that was kind of completely fabulously implemented in the first year. So it's quite natural that we had problems. It's quite natural that people were running into compliance, into a compliance mindset. But to conclude from that immediately, you know, that you need to de-scope 90% of the companies under the directive, I think is the wrong conclusion.
Yeah, but what we did see before the omnibus was a huge development in AI systems, in collecting data, and I think it was not taking into account all these tools that were made. And what we see now is that we have AI tools that to a large extent, we need the human in the loop, but to a large extent can make a DMA, can even say, of all the initiatives with this company within this line of industry, where are the most financially benefits actions you can take, and so on. So there's a lot of tools supporting this. And some of these companies were startups that are now closing down because, it's not being used. But I think, that wave of waiting another year or two, the burden would have been so much lower.
Interesting.
Fully agree.
Yeah, I think just coming back to the question about language, I do think that we need to really have a better translation mechanism, because those of us who grew up with, understanding the sustainability terminology, getting the lingo and pushing for that sort of change, we need to understand how the normal business works, and that's what I've been doing throughout all my career, has been about integrating sustainability into business. Where I am now is much more about integrating business into sustainability thinking, and so I do appreciate that we are coming from different sides, but what we need for conventional business thinking to open up and not just think about, as you mentioned, Jennifer, the short term, only the financial capital, but looking at some of the other assets and dependencies that a company would have. For that, they need that translation that we can provide. But we do need a common language, and if that language has to be the plain business language, then I think that is worth going for.
Okay. I can't believe I'm saying this, but we're getting kind of close to the end here. But there's a question in the chat that I would like to take some inspiration from to ask you all something, because we've talked about perhaps going too fast with these new regulations. And there's a question here about whether multiple regulations make businesses nervous and they might try to go a bit more slowly than we would like to see. I want to pick out this question about the pace of change, because Andreas, you mentioned the studies that the first year is always very difficult with new regulations, but it's not really up to us how fast we go, because what we've got is the pressure from the planetary boundaries and the pressure of rising temperatures. So can you quickly, this is a tough thing to ask you to do quickly, but can you quickly try to say something about what kind of pace of change we can manage in compelling sustainability and a focus on environmental responsibilities from businesses?
It's a difficult question, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, the discussion over the last, let's say, 24 months have shown that probably businesses' ability to manage a significant amount of regulations at the same time is limited. And I can understand that, right? I mean, there are certain limits. I mean, there are practical limits also of what you can do. On the other hand, we also need to look at the reality. And if we had a natural scientist here, like, for instance, Rockström or others, they would probably tell us, well, look, I mean, we are not running out of time. We actually have already run out of time. It's actually too late now. We are just talking about overshoot at this time. So in that sense, probably maybe we also need to rethink what kind of pace of change is proportionate, because we need a much higher pace if we still want to make a difference. And maybe then we need governments also to support businesses more in handling a higher pace of change. One of the reasons why businesses could not handle the pace of change with regard to the many regulations, for instance, was that the system wasn't ready. There was no guidance out there. The auditors, for instance, had no real guidance when it came to CSRD, first wave auditing. So in this sense, I think maybe also the policymakers need to invest more to make the system ready for keeping a higher pace of change.
That's an excellent point. I mean, I saw the first drafts of ESRSs and data points for CSRD, and I thought, oh my God, as a data person, these are made by lawyers and people who are not working with data. So that's an extremely good point. But answering how, what companies can do here now, I mean, in my mind, I would say the system, that what I have experienced working with sustainability as a business person is that it has broadened my view of how things really are interworking and related altogether. So, if you have a company struggling with some agenda, I would certainly recommend to reach out to the network, if not in the board. Have people who understand AI, have people who understand sustainability, have people who understand the markets and all the traditional stuff, because you need, a coherent plan that works here and now, but also for the longer run.
Okay, we're just about out of time. So what I want to do is get all of our panelists to answer a quick fire question. What's one thing that medium-sized companies should do as they consider how to incorporate sustainability in their business? Susanne, can we start with you?
Yeah, I think I've said it already. I would follow the money, and I would understand where money is coming from and how we can generate profits for the long term. And then
Andreas
relies on that mapping I mentioned before.
Great, thank you.
I would say get your board on board. Go to the boardroom, talk to them, ask them whether they know about these things. Ask them whether they have the competencies to assess and to discuss these topics. And then I think you will see some change.
Ole?
And to complement that, I would say, do a simple DMA, because then your board works on stuff what matters for the planet and for the company.
Okay. We've just done it down to the wire. We're just about out of time. So a big thank you to all of our speakers for today's session. Susanne, Andreas, and Ole, thank you for your valuable insights and for engaging with the questions from participants. We've seen strong interest today, and while we may not have been able to address every question in detail, we encourage you to consider to continue the conversation with us. With that in mind, for those who are interested, we're planning to organize a small by-invitation roundtable for mid-sized companies. This will be an opportunity for a more focused and practical exchange, and further details will be shared shortly. Thank you all of us for joining this afternoon, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.
And
thanks to the participants. Bye-bye.